This is the second pedal board we've done for this customer, and it still took 8 months to finish. I'm gonna tell you why. I've had the pleasure of working with Robert on his rigs a couple of times now, and I truly mean pleasure. Robert is awesome to work with, and I'm gonna go through why that's the case and why his rigs turn out better than most. Today, we are gonna go into Robert's latest build, and it consists of a mini pedal board or satellite board that feeds into the main pedal board. There is a whole lot going on in this. I wanna start off with the junction box, kind of the heart of the main rig, and I wanna show you what we did to give him the options that he needed for his pedal board. And I will say, for the haters out there that may or may not exist, Robert has tested all of this stuff thoroughly. On his first board, a lot of ideas were tried, and on his second board, the one we're talking about today, those ideas that stuck, that worked, that served the sound that he was trying to get, stayed on this board, and we cut the rest. So the features, the options, the junction box that you see here is designed from trial and error, first-hand experience, and it has been road tested, and this is where we ended up. So let's get into the junction box. All of the connections on this main pedal board where the junction box lives are fed through the Schmidt patch bays or patch panels, connector boxes, whatever you want to call them. They all go through these connector boxes to and from the junction box. The reason I say this is because you have to take extra care when you're using patch bays, junction boxes, connector boxes, that the grounds are taken care of appropriately. Ground loops are one of the most frustrating things you can come across in a rig, and a junction box is a great way to solve them. But even if the junction box has sorted out the ground loops and then feeds to a patch bay or connector box that does not have this same signal flow in mind, the problem can just reappear one patch cable later. So we had to be extra careful on this pedal board design to make sure that we didn't solve the problem in one area on the junction box and have it reappear 6 inches away at a connector box before it left the pedal board. This main junction box, fed through the connector boxes on the Schmidt board, has the ability to run wet, dry, wet 2 times over. What do I mean by that? Well, it's pretty cool actually. Robert loves to play both acoustic and electric, and on his first board build we did a couple of years ago, he had the idea of running wet, dry, wet on his electric and wet, dry, wet on his acoustic, obviously with pared down effects on the acoustic, but being able to feed his rehearsal studio and live gigging environments with 3 lines of acoustic and 3 lines of electric. It may seem a little bit crazy, but until you then try it, which he has at length, and it works for his sound, now it's something that he really enjoys using. So the junction box has an acoustic input, an electric input, ascend to the dry effects, and then we come back to the junction box where we allow both an acoustic dry out and an electric dry out. Now, when you do this with multiple signal paths, one for acoustic, one for electric, but the electric having an amp sim on board, how do you get around leaving the amp sim for just the electric, but not the acoustic? Well, we ended up coming in after the last dry effect and then giving him an amp sim loop that is for electric only. It is only in the electric dry path. Now he can actually decide per preset if he's going to be using acoustic or electric, and over Midi or amp channel switching jacks from his switcher, the junction box will respond appropriately. So now he can switch seamlessly back and forth between wet, dry, wet acoustic and wet, dry, wet electric with or without amp sim. I know this is complicated, but stick with me here. After that, we feed into the wet effects for the wet section of the pedal board. Now we go into delays, reverbs, some modulation, and eventually we come back to the junction box in stereo And now we do this all over again like we did for the dry section, except now we are doing it for stereo wet effects. So we have a stereo set of outputs for acoustic and a stereo set of outputs for electric. Now you might be asking at this point, why don't you just run one dry output and then the front of house guy can choose between acoustic and electric on the sound desk, and then one set of wet outputs. And again, the sound person can decide between acoustic and electric at the sound desk. These are a lot of moving parts, and you are asking for mismatch or errors in communication between the two people, let alone needing to have two profiles set up for different EQ settings for acoustic and for electric. Gets further complicated again with one set of outputs if you want to use tube amps for your electric and go straight to front of house for acoustic. So it really was a necessity to have dedicated outputs per instrument to make this happen. The way that we keep track of all of the details and specs of this junction box is through a doc. For some of you, this is admin and you're about to shut off, but it is probably the most important thing that we do when it comes to custom specs, feature lists, especially on a changing plane. It's not like we will always decide on a feature list on day one and that feature list never changes as we're going through the project. Things change, new gear is released, ideas come up that wasn't thought of on day one. So we use a shared doc that we can update and everyone can see the changes, get notified of things that are happening, ask questions, and this allows us to stay on top of important details instead of searching long email chains like we used to do. And those email chains frequently got over 100, 150 emails, and you're just scanning, trying to find out. It didn't work. So this shared doc is a way for us to show layouts, ask questions, update specs, and make sure that things aren't missed. Now that you have a basic idea of the junction box and its function, wet, dry, wet across acoustic and electric, now we can move on to the pedal board builds. As I mentioned, the pedal boards, the small and the main, are all running through patch bays or D-sockets. Those locking jacks or XLR panels are D-socket style jacks. And we need to be careful we do not run into ground loops, but we also need to be careful that we make the right connections between boards and that they're positioned in the right place on both pedal boards. The last thing you want is to plug out of the left side of the small board, which is situated to the right of the main board, and then have to run a cable all the way around to the left side of the big board. It just isn't going to work very well if you have to do that. So we thought through the connections and we made sure that they would connect well. The small board starts with two acoustic inputs. These feed into the Grace Designs Felix 2, which is basically an acoustic preamp, EQ, and a few other cool things that it can do to your acoustic signal. And then we carry on to the B1G, which is a boost, and then out of that small board onto the main board. If Robert didn't want to use the main board for an acoustic type gig, he could just take the small board, bring it to the gig, and be done with it. He'd have the Felix, the B1G, and he's good to go. We designed it with modularity in mind, so he can use just the small board, or just the big board, or both together. This, again, part of the planning, is what took a little bit of extra time to make sure we got it right. As well as having the two acoustic inputs, which are switched by the Felix, I might add, there's also an electric input that comes in the small board and straight out the other end to feed the big board. This is so the guitar inputs, when the small board is being used, are all in the same location. Other than that, nothing is really happening on the small board for electric, and so we just head out the other side and feed the big board. In addition to this, you can see 3 rollers. These things are awesome. By Chase Bliss Audio. These are expression rollers. So we went from the 3 expression rollers on the small board to the side panel jacks on the small board and fed 3 expression lines to the main board. I'll go over what these do when I'm talking about that section on the main board in just a second. Lastly, there is a Coda stomp on this board as well, which takes care of sheet music, charging your iPad and flipping pages. This was hard to power because it takes 1500 milliamps if you're gonna keep an iPad charged. So we had to do a current tripler on the Chalk's power supply to make this happen. And it was pretty straightforward after that. We went through a side panel on the angled board, and you can plug up to his iPad and get control over his sheet music while playing. That is the small board. Now let's head on to the main board, and we'll go through all the routing and the features going on there. The main pedal board starts with guitar inputs through the Schmidt-Array connector box. This is now one acoustic input and one electric input. If the small board had two acoustic ins, why do we only have one on the main board? Well, the main reason is the Felix on the small board switches between two acoustic inputs, sends one acoustic output, and then we feed the B1G into the main board here. So one acoustic input, one electric input, and then it's on to the junction box that we talked about earlier for the acoustic. The electric feeds into a one control mini looper, which is holding a fuzz. The reason we did this is we ran out of loops on the Gig Rig G3S and we needed an extra loop. You don't want to put a fuzz after a buffer, which is going to happen once we get into the G3S. So we decided to put the one control loop before the G3, fuzz in that loop, and then we could remotely control it via Midi and turn it on and off per preset from the G3, making it easy to control and add in more loops to this setup because of this approach. From there, we head on into the Origin Effects Cali 76, which is a compressor, a great one. And then we go into the Gig Rig G3S. The G3S has been updated recently to have scribble strips or little screens beside each foot switch, so you can actually name things digitally per preset. Pretty handy feature. Also in the Gig Rig, you have 12 loops. You can also reorder these loops or run them in parallel per preset, which Robert is taking advantage of. Let's go through the loops and what is actually being run from 1 to 12. The tuner loop is sending to an ST300 mini tuner by Sonic Research. Loop 1 is a Vemoram Buddy G. Loop 2 is a Shanks ODS1. Loop 3, 5-watt World Bus. Loop 4, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. We have an MXR looper. From there we go to the Gig Rig More or Less, which is basically volume that can be controlled externally. Then we go into the Junction Box dry in. We have a send and return loop also on the Junction Box for the Tonezar Power Glide, a great pedal if you ever get the chance. We also have the SIM, the Amp SIM send and return loop, which is housing a Tone X1. Then we have the wet send. So we've kind of gone through the dry in and then we're sending back to the wet effects. After the wet send, we finish off that loop. Loop 4 is now complete. From there, we have to pair up multiple loops to run a pedal in stereo. So loop 5 and loop 6 are running the Red Wing modulator. Loop 7 and 8 are running the Microcosm by Hologram. Loop 9 and 10, the Bunar Tube Deluxe, and that is running in dual mono. Loop 11 and 12 is the Chase Bliss 1978, also being run in stereo. Then we leave the G3S and we go to the Junction Box, and then finally out to the Schmidt-Array patch bay. You might think we're done talking about this main pedal board, but we're not even close. Let's get into the rest of the extras. We made a custom remote switch for Robert that is programmable. So it has 2 foot switches on it. One side goes to the Goodwood Junction Box to mute the dry outputs of acoustic and electric. The other foot switch is actually going out of the pedal board via a back panel D socket for amp channel switching. Then we have 2 remote switches available on the G3S. Remote switches are typically used for amp channel switching to change from a clean sound to a dirty right on the amp, but obviously you can use these for multiple things. You don't have to just use it for amp channel switching. So in this case, we're sending another one of these channels to the Goodwood Junction Box, and we are able to bypass or engage the Tonezar Power Glide. We built a true bypass loop into the junction to make this doable per preset. The other remote switch from the G3 is also going to the Junction Box, and it is what decides if the Junction Box is running electric or acoustic. It changes all three outputs and some additional routing, so dry, left wet, and right wet all flip between acoustic or electric at the same time. Just when you thought this was getting a little bit over the top, I want to go through all the connections that are on the side panels of the Schmidt array. All have been vetted and tested by Robert as something that he actually uses. So before you say it's over the top, if it actually gets used frequently, I think it's something that you can justify. So let's get into all of the connections here. On the right side connector box, we have an AC input, acoustic, electric input. We have the Chase Bliss roller inputs, which are expression. That is TRS in 1, 2, and 3. Then we have a left side connector box on the other side of the Schmidt array pedal board, and that has an acoustic dry out, acoustic wet left and right out, so that's 3 for acoustic, electric dry, electric wet, left and right, so 3 for electric. That connector box is now fully accounted for. Then we have a couple of rear panel sections that are also being used. The rear left, we have D sockets for a 12-volt barrel, DC power, essentially leaving the pedal board for off-board power. We have another spare 9-volt barrel amp. Then we have the rear panel right side D sockets. We have 2 5-pin Midi outs, one for a Hedgehog amp and one for an off-board Tone Dexter 2. So both of those controlled by Midi. One locking TRS, which goes to the Fryette PS100 for channel switching, which I mentioned earlier. You can also see here the layouts that we had mocked up before the board was fully built, a layout that Robert did here himself, and then we head down into the small board layout, which you can see was mocked up and looked quite similar to the real thing that we finished off with. The biggest thing I want to point out for all of this is that Robert didn't just theorize about what he thought he might like. The reason that this took 8 months from beginning to end is that instead of just theorizing, Robert actually tested this stuff out at home with his gear. So if he wanted to try parallel wet effects, he would try it out before committing to it on the rig. If he wanted to try amp channel switching on his PS100, he would try it out and make sure that the sounds were usable to his context. If he wanted acoustic in wet, dry, wet, which he did on his first board, even then, he tested it out first so that he wasn't going to just be coming up with a laundry list of features that would never actually get used in a real live or studio scenario. All of this stuff was tested before it ended up on the rig, from individual pedals, sounds, options, and then all the way through to the gig rig and running his effects in parallel in their environment. All tested, all vetted by Robert, and then we tried after that to pare it down to the features that he would actually use, not the features he thought he would use, which I promise you are very different things. All of these features are going to be used in studio, rehearsal, or playing gigs by Robert in the next few months. I know for some of you there are strong opinions on what is over the top, but something I've wanted to do, and we'll probably do a future video on anyways, is I personally think your board needs to be as simple as you can make it and no more complicated than that. But I also think if you can justify the features and pedals that you have on your board and you use them often, I don't think it's overkill. At the end of the day here, we are building pedal boards that we enjoy using and help us create better music. I'd love to know your guys' take on this. Is there a board that is too big or too small? What are your thoughts on it? Let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think about Robert's pedal board and if you would use this in a gigging scenario. Your thoughts on acoustic wet, dry, wet, electric wet, dry, wet, and being able to control everything via Midi through the Gig Rig G3S. Would love to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the comments below.